30,000 impressions later.
20 minutes later. 24 hours later. 48 hours later. A few inches later. A few minutes later. A few moments later. A little later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 8 hours later. And a flashback. Eventually. Flashback. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
2,000 years later. 2 very boring minutes later. 3 days later. 5 hours later. 5 minutes later. 7:59 a.m. 8 hours later. 10 seconds later. 15 minutes later. Later that same evening. Many hours later. Meanwhile. Moments later. More moments later. Much later. Much later. Much later. 1 eternity later.
1 hour later!
1 pair of pants later. 1 week later. Several days later. Several song-filled hours later. Soon after. The following day. The following Thursday. Yesterday. 2,000 years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2, day 3, day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up. Meanwhile, 2 hours later. 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that he is shaping up. And a flashback. Soon after. Montage. Yesterday. Meanwhile, back in the Lola. A few moments later. Moments later. Moments later. More moments later. 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 In the void. Much later. Much later. Much later. Much later. The following Thursday. Later that same evening. Just then, by sheer coincidence. 12 o'clock midnight. 3:28 a.m. 7:59 a.m. 8:01 p.m. 10 seconds later. 12 seconds later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. Same evening. Several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. Epilogue. The next day. 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much later. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. 3 days later. Opening night. Later. 3,000 years later. 1 week later. 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later. 3 days later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. The following Thursday. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. Much later. Much later. 7 hours later. Epilogue. Several song-filled hours later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later. Several months later. Thousands of tears later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 2 hours later. much later. Yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day, meanwhile, later, just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowland, 1 frozen wasteland later, 2 very boring minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 11 minutes later, 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later, 1 hour later, 1 hour later, 2 hours 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 later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 5 hours later, 346 minutes later, 6 hours later, 6 hours later, 6.5 hours later, 7 hours later, 8 hours later, 8 hours later, approximately 10 hours later, several song-filled hours later, many hours later, many unbearable hours later, marrow for sure, 24 hours later, 24 hours later, early the next morning, 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 the next day, the next day, the next day, the following day, tomorrow, the very next evening, day 2, 48 hours later, 2 days later, day 3, 72 hours later, 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, day 4, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later, several days later, 1 week later, 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 3 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 6 months later, several months later, many months later, 75 years later, 2,000 years later, 3,000 years later, 1 eternity later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab opening night, a lot of boring math later, many tic-tacs later, 1 semester later, 1 debt to society later, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 long angry line later, 1 shift later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 1 winner later, 1 pair of pants later, 298 frozen patties later, thousands of tears later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, later in the void, approximately 10 hours later, early the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later, 72 hours later, 2 hours later, just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage, the next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, end of flashback, 3,000 whoop-whoos later,
80,000 impressions later.
would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. A few inches later, eventually, several bad puns later. Graduation day. Epilogue. Epilogue. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning, Moments later. More moments later. 1 semester later. Graduation day.
1 hour later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. Later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 2 hours later. Meanwhile. 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time.